Welcome to the Puzzle of Us, where we are helping you pick up the broken pieces of marriage, life, and love and put them back together to feel whole again. I'm your host, Chelsea Peterson, owner and clinical director of Cache Valley Counseling. Today I have Casey Neely and Laura Whitney joining me today to talk to you about social anxiety in teens. What's normal, what's abnormal, things to look out for, symptoms that you might see in your teen, as well as some tips and tricks of how to help them through it, and know how to get help if your teen is experiencing some anxiety. So Casey and Laura work at Cache Valley Counseling with me, and we are so grateful to have them on tonight. Thanks for joining us tonight, guys.
Happy to.
All right, so first of all, what are you guys noticing about, or what do you notice? What are some of the symptoms? What are things that are, what's normal with normal teens and what's not normal with social anxieties, teen stress? What's normal, what's not normal?
I think I like to explain to my teens that a level of anxiety is normal. Like we're wired to kind of scan for things that might be harmful or dangerous to us. But we should, like, if we spike, if there's something that stresses us out, we should be able to regulate back to a place in the middle. And then sometimes we might feel a little sadness or depression, but then regulate back to the middle. And so we need to be kind of listening to ourselves and see, am I like kind of revved up here at the top of this all the time, and I'm tired all the time because I feel this great amount of stress or great amount of anxiety.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's tricky because when they're teens, they're not little kids anymore. They're not adults. And so we want them to have some level of ownership and like independence and stuff. But like at the same time, I feel like if a teen is suffering from like authentic anxiety, like it's going to be really hard for them to recognize. I think they're going to be just miserable and not, but it will just express itself in another way. So I think it's really the parents and adults around them, mentors and stuff, to kind of be watching for it in the first place.
So what sort of things would they be watching for? Like if someone is, sort of revved up all the time, as Laura was saying, as like they're going to have the normal ebbs and flows, but if someone maybe stays stuck in that sort of revved up stage, like what sort of things might they be seeing? Like as a parent, what would they be recognizing in their children?
I think it could go a couple different ways. Maybe isolating, or maybe never wanting to be alone, like both of those extremes. Maybe like a lot of negativity or fear, lots of fears about themselves, like their place, like where they're standing, like maybe are they good enough, things like that, questions maybe like in that area, over like excessively probably. What do you see, Laura?
I think irritability is a good sign of anxiety. They're kind of short-tempered because they're using all their energy in this other way, and they don't have a lot of patience. Kind of being snippish, which is hard because a lot of teens are like that. But if you're seeing it consistently and sort of out of proportion to what's happening, teens are going to get a little irritable when you're enforcing rules and that kind of thing normally. But if it seems like it's sort of an abnormal amount or like way too quick to pop to that, I think that's a good sign to look for.
Yeah, I think teens is hard because you've got this irritability level of the moodiness, like things that are just already happening and what's normal and what's not normal. And then how do you know if they're normalized or if this is just how you are or if this is anxiety? And I think that's a lot of the questions that we're getting. And I would always, something I usually always say to my parents is that trust your gut. Like your parent instinct knows like if this is normal or if I'm starting to worry that this is not normal. So I like to tell parents to trust their gut too, but if they have questions, and then ask questions. that I think the hard thing with kids too, with teens, is because a lot of them do want to be adult and responsible. And so they tend to, many of them don't have the words, or they don't want to have the words. And so oftentimes they're still not using their words, or they're not really saying like, oh, I'm having a hard time today, or, you know, they're not as verbal as we sometimes hope they would be. So I think it's good to also be looking for kind of those behavioral things still that you're still looking for in kids, but maybe they aren't as, you know, they're not the temper tantrums, the throwing themselves on the floor, screaming or throwing things, you know, they could be, but most likely they've grown out of that, but there's still some behavioral stuff that is kind of signaling that there's something else going on. Would you guys agree? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good thought, that parents really are the most in tune. I think what's tricky about anxiety is, though, because we have a normal amount of that danger awareness that I was talking about, that sometimes it sneaks up on us. And if our anxiety starts to increase, if our stress in the environment around us starts to increase, we kind of cope and adapt because that's what we're wired to do. And so we think, okay, I got this, I can do this. But then the next thing we know, we're not handling it anymore. And that can be hard, like you were saying, for that younger underdeveloped brain to kind of realize, hold on, I'm not right. Something's not right with me, and I don't know how to verbalize this.
Yeah.
Something interesting that has been kind of like in my attention lately, and I do see it with a few of my clients, is well, it's kind of a double thing, but like what you're saying, Laura, is this kind of like constant state of anxiety. And like, we know that being a teen has always been stressful. It's always like, you know, puberty and branching away from parents and everything. Like, it's a stressful time. But there's, you know, like science out to back this up a little bit more concretely, of that because of the technology that we have and that kids have, you know, most teens have a phone with internet, with social media. And so they're always kind of in this state of, it's like being like in a constant state of threat, because they're exposed to so much, whether that's seeing like danger that's happening in the world, or if that's like posting something and waiting for people to like it and they don't like it, or maybe there's bullies online, or like there's no like real security because they're exposed all the time to the world. And so what that does is put them kind of in this constant state of like maybe like low grade anxiety, which becomes chronic. And before you know it, it's unmanageable.
Yeah, and I've actually had a couple of teens, or like low 20-year-olds come in and tell me, like, I always feel like I'm being watched. Like, the people around here are always staring at you in the store. And I'm like, I don't think the people are staring at you. I think you're used to there being cameras everywhere, and somebody's always watching and somebody's always posting. And so we've got this generation growing up feeling like they're always being watched. And that's going to give you that sense of anxiety. Like, I'm not safe because I'm being watched. I'm being judged all the time.
Yeah. And it's like constant opportunity for rejection.
Yeah.
Whether that's like explicit or implicit, you know.
Yeah. And whether it's, you know, a good thing or a bad thing, they seem to always kind of be looking at themselves. You know, they're taking selfies, they're playing with the filters. And my gut's telling me that's not a good thing, to always be looking at yourself, because it's either going to push you into this place of pride, or it's going to push you into this place of self-judgment and looking for all your flaws. And I think that's more where we tend to go when we see ourselves all the time. We're going to start looking for flaws and thinking that everybody is seeing these.
Yeah.
I think that's great. I mean, I even just think back to my own experience in high school, and there was definitely more anxiety at school or after school at the extracurricular activities, things like that. But then you go home and there's sort of like this safe haven. There's this like break from it, because it's not a constant, you know, cell phones were just barely coming out, and they didn't have internet plans, and they were, you know, who was texting you or whatever, but it was not what it is today. And I feel for these youth, but yeah, it's just also part of the world that we're living in. So how do we help them live in the world? And continue to adapt at such a constant level of stress all the time.
Right. And I don't think just having that is necessarily going to be a direct, like going to determine whether a teen has anxiety or not. Because I do have a client that she doesn't get on her phone. She's only allowed to be on her phone for 20 minutes a day. But she's got high anxiety because of other stressors in her life so it doesn't necessarily mean that's the only thing or going to determine it, but
Casey, I liked how you were talking about just teens have always, the teenage years have always been hard. You're going through puberty and starting to go through this separation from parents and building your own identity. And there's this innate, I was talking about my goats and the herd mentality, and there's this sort of herd community mentality that we have as human beings too, and the fear of being rejected by your community, and that we equate that to, a physical danger. Like I'll say in my therapy sessions, if we feel like we might be rejected or kicked out of our community or our family or whatever, we equate that to the dinosaur walking in the room, and that this is the same fear of death. If we are ousted, we are going to die. And so there's this overwhelming fear of rejection.
Yeah, it's an evolution thing. Yeah. So it really does come down. I had to explain that to my clients as well. It's ingrained. It's not.
It's a primal
deep in there.
Primal need to belong and to find that sense of belonging. And like us as adults typically find at least another person to have that with, and we're sort of in that already, or working towards that, or we found that in ourselves, or we know who our people are. But teens are still, they're like leaving the herd and finding their own herd, but then where do I go and what does that look like? And I want to fit in, and I want to, it's always been there, but it's definitely exacerbated by some of this. So going back to some of the symptoms, I think irritability is definitely one. Isolation, Casey, you mentioned isolation. Teens definitely, isolating themselves. Turning down social engagements is something, I know that there's a Friday night football game. I know my friends are going and I just don't want to go, right? So if you see, or as a parent, that there's something happening, but you find your teen not wanting to go, asking the questions, probing them, not forcing them to talk, but creating an environment in which they feel safe enough to be able to start to open up is I feel like really important. Sometimes grades drop, a lack of interest in things that maybe were of interest to them, or now they suddenly don't want to be interested in them or want to be involved in them anymore. Anything else? What else do you guys see that
sleep is huge. Yeah. Checking in with your teen, because you're not watching them like when they're a baby or when they're a little kid, you're not as aware. So lots of my clients will report little sleep or extensive sleep, but their parents don't know because they're not monitoring them all the time, which is totally normal.
Which is also a little bit difficult too, because teens are also going through that puberty stage, and you get some that are couldn't sleep 24/7, and it doesn't matter how much they sleep, and they seem to be tired all the time, but they have no social anxiety.
Right.
So again, I think that can be indicative of it, but just because your teen seems to be sleeping a lot, again, doesn't necessarily mean that they have this social anxiety. So I think it's important to look at all the things, all the factors, and go with what your gut is telling you. But anything else like sleep, eating, what else?
Change, appetite change, changes in behavior that they seem different. Even something like a elevated scare response, like you're just trying to spook them or something, and the response is way out of proportion to what it should be. Or they change, interactions with their friends, and their grades might change if they're suddenly struggling with something. They're, how they function, because with anxiety we also find a lot of brain fog, forgetting, and that kind of thing. And so they may struggle with school when the anxiety is taking up so much of their energy.
Mm-hmm. As you were talking, Laura, I was also thinking sort of dangerous behavior sometimes can also be, you know, again,
Yeah.
at the risk of being rejected or the risk of being not a part of a group or belonging, some teens do tend to have riskier behaviors, right? Like they're always speeding, or they, you know, steal a car, or they, you know, do things that they shouldn't be doing, and engage in a little bit more dangerous behavior. Again, not all teens, some teens.
Yeah, but that makes me also think of the opposite, like the perfectionist kids, the people pleaser
Yeah.
kids. I'll
Yep.
have some parents to be like, "Oh, that kid is so chill," and I'm like, are they? Or are they just trying to not trying to not engage in contention, trying to not create any problems because their anxiety is so high? They're just trying to, you know, make sure everybody's happy, make sure nobody's fighting, make sure nobody's getting yelled at, because that's just too much for them to handle.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, watching out for the kid in your family that is kind of the peacemaker. I think they tend to be a little more susceptible just because they're very worried about causing any more stress in the family.
Or even the straight A student, it's like, do they know that they can get a B and it's okay? Or are
Mhm.
they like so driven
That's a
to
huge
achieve?
problem. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's like what I would see more often, I would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes those overachievers, they're like
Mhm.
trying to run towards validation and try to run towards acceptance and run away from this noise in their head.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah. So basically, to sum all of this up, your kid could be doing anything.
Literally.
But really, I think the important thing is just anything that's out of the ordinary, sudden changes, things that you might be noticing, if they can put words to it, if they can be verbal and identify ways that they are feeling, you know, scared or fearful, nervousness, you know, some kids, specifically some of the kids that I've worked with recently, have been so anxious that they like work themselves up in sort of, particularly with the social anxiety, work themselves up into a fit almost before, in anticipatory, like in anticipation for an event that's happening, right? Like I'm going to girls camp and I can't sleep for 3 days before because I'm worried about fitting in, and I'm worried about, well, what if I can't do that, or what if nobody includes me, or what if, you know, like they start going through all the what if scenarios, and they tend to not sleep. They tend to be they can cry more, they can be more irritable, they can just be a little bit more sort of irrational, hard to talk out of things, really concerned about a lot of things that
I think
probably shouldn't be concerned about.
looking up the difference, like even just of anxiety and fear,
Mhm.
like fear is helpful and anxiety is not. So even just if it's getting like overwhelming for you as the parent, like, is this normal response? Is it not normal response? Like, even just breaking it down and being like, okay, let's see if this is like helpful to be worrying about this. Like, what are the good reasons you might worry about this? That makes sense that you would worry about that. And like kind of going through that or and see what that brings up. Because there's a difference between being scared and having anxiety.
Right. So that would be something that someone could do. If their teen is experiencing something like this, a parent could sort of sit down with them and say, okay, part of this is normal. It's okay to be a little bit worried that I might not fit in, or I might get left out of an activity, or I might be chosen last, or like that's okay. There's a little bit of fear with that, and that's okay, but then sort of normalizing it to the point that they are no longer, or they feel safe, or they don't feel like something's wrong with them, or things like that, right? And also helping them cope in that moment, right? Like, what do I do with this fear? There's an amount of this that is normal, but then there's an amount of this that is so overwhelming that I make myself so sick that I don't even want to go to camp, or I don't want to go to the dance, or I don't want to take the test, or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
I think a good indicator too is like, how are you able to respond in that moment? If your kid is doing that and they're getting so worked up, what's happening to you?
Hmm.
If you're able to kind of think clearly and stuff, or if you get kind of like caught up in your own reaction, That's important.
Yeah, how a parent reacts to what a kid's going through is almost a bigger deal than what they're going through. Like they need to know that they're safe to feel it and express it. And especially when they're even struggling to name it or put words, like if the parents can create that safety, like it's okay, everybody goes through this. This is a hard time of life. And this is a hard stage in the history of the world. There's a lot of stuff going on just coming out of COVID, and a lot of stress that everyone's been going through. And I agree that normalizing it. And I like to tell them, like, nobody's looking at you as much as you think they are, because they're all worried about themselves. Like everybody's kind of going through this same thing in this teen stage of this. Am I accepted? Am I being watched? Am I being judged? Am I being accepted?
Yeah. I'm just making some notes here. You guys are coming up with some great things. So really, parents should be creating safety, normalizing what they're going through, looking at their own reaction of how am I responding to this? Yeah, I think those are great things. What does a parent do if they feel like they have done that and they've tried to create safety? How do they help their kid, like force them to go to these social events? Like what do they do when they're so worked up and they're so worried about, am I going to fit in, and all the normal, and normalizing it doesn't necessarily help, or they still, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh time that they do this, they're still getting so worked up about first day of school or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
How long, what's normal? How many times do people go through this? What's normal? What's not normal?
Yeah, I think it's tricky because I'll often talk to my clients about when we obey anxiety and kind of give in and do the avoidance behavior, then we've just strengthened it. But on the flip side of that, if a parent forces us to face a fear that we're not ready to face, that is going to also ingrain it deeper and make it harder the next time. So this is kind of a tricky area for parents, I think. So I think it's important to help the kids help themselves. Like we want to encourage them to make that choice on their own to face this fear and understand why and how the cycle of anxiety works, rather than just saying no questions asked, you've got to go. And we can teach them, those basic skill levels, basic breathing techniques, basic grounding techniques that are trying to address what the central nervous system is doing in order to help them get their cerebral cortex engaging again and being part of the conversation, rather than just letting that fight, flight, freeze response take over and run their whole show for them.
I think this is why I asked or suggested, like, if the parent can check in, if we can check in and like be present, or if we're just dysregulated. Because if we're dysregulated, we're probably going to want to jump in and hurry and fix it and hurry and force something, or like, because it's like making us really nervous. Like we don't want our kid to be left out. We don't want our kid to be isolated or get left behind or all these things. But the problem is, like,
we're also overwhelmed and have our own stuff going on,
Yeah.
or whatever, and we may become dismissive of like, I can't deal with this right now. You got to get your crap together and deal with this on your own, right? Like, so there is a number of ways that we as parents could respond poorly to our child.
Yeah, and we all do that.
But every single one of us.
And I think but we're like, I think that's kind of skipping a step where they're not getting that understanding of like, okay, why is this happening? Like, what's the context behind this? Like, you clearly something's going on. Let me help you put words to that, or whatever it is. And then offering maybe like, okay, what do you think you should do? Because unsolicited advice is not like never really helpful.
Yeah. So what you're saying is like really helping them to connect with their child, understand where the anxiety is coming from, understand what the fears are. Maybe it's a sense of not feeling like they're belonging, or worried about, being chosen last, or whatever it is, but understanding, connecting before they correct or offer advice or solicit options for them.
I think so.
Yeah.
But I think it's easier to say that than actually do it.
Well, yeah, and I think the other
Yeah.
thing I hear from parents is often like, well, how much I don't want to baby my kid too much, right?
Mhm.
And if they've done this 3, 4, 5, 10 times and we're on 10 and they still, we're not going to go to the first day of school of ninth grade 10 times, right? Like,
Mhm.
but it's going to be a new school year every year and a new dance and a new social situation. So there's new fears and there's new things and there's new, so it's also, yes, it's the same thing. It's the same kind of root at it, but how long do they sit with it before it's like, okay, you also maybe need to get some help. Again, some of the things you talked about, Laura, breathing, grounding, regulating our central nervous system, right? Like a lot of parents don't know that. I certainly didn't learn any of that before becoming a therapist. So
Right.
my parents didn't teach me. So again, it's like important to become informed about that stuff. There's tons of stuff out there about different breathing techniques, grounding techniques, and those are certainly, I have found, very helpful to do in the moment with teens. But Casey, as you were saying, it's also important to know, like, am I getting dysregulated? Am I not
I mean,
responding how I should to the teen in this situation?
I think in the end, if that's not being taken care of and addressed, I don't think your teen is going to, I think your teen will build off of that example or that
Yeah, and Casey,
model.
I was going
that
to add, I
experience.
think that could go back to the beginning of our conversation in a way to kind of know there's a problem. I mean, we learn that as therapists. If we feel it in the room, it's probably there. And so if a parent is feeling that anxiety, they can check in and be like, am I picking up on this from one of my kids? And maybe I need to check in. And then that can also be used as validation, like, hey, yeah, I get it. I understand what this anxiety is like. And so that the parent feeling it becomes, a diagnostic and a validating tool and a way to connect with your child all at the same time.
Yeah. And I want to be clear that I think you definitely need some boundaries. Like, I feel like school, your kids need to go to school. Like, it's not going to help them to stay home. And so I think, I'm not saying like just listen to what they have to say. Like, I think there does need to be option. Like, you need to understand it and let them know you understand. But hey, I care about you, and this is why I'm making you go, even though I understand all that. But I know as your parent, like, you're going to be better off going.
It's going to be harder tomorrow if you don't go today.
Right.
Yep. And I think that's where, a lot of parents sort of struggle is if I say, okay, well, there's something social going on at school today. Sure, you can stay home today, but then it becomes a fight for sometimes years down the road before your kid graduates of them barely making it to school. And so it's setting those boundaries, hearing them, but also setting those rules, setting the, family expectations, setting boundaries of, in our house, we go to school. This is what we do. And I'm sorry you're feeling this way. Let's talk about why you're feeling that way. Let's create that safety. Let's normalize that some of those things are normal, and then be able to help them sort of push through that or experience that in a way that they can have a more positive experience with it.
Especially if there's any danger happening, any bullying or something like that. I think not to ignore any of that happening either.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
Addressing getting a plan or whatever, knowing that someone's looking out for them,
Yeah. So when does a parent know, like, I need more help? I can't do this on my own. What are some things that you would kind of be the first indications that you would say, like, look for this, or when you feel this, or when your kid is feeling this way, like, where are the markers, right? Because I certainly, as a therapist, appreciate someone coming in sooner rather than later and not waiting till the kid is, experienced an eating disorder for several years because we have social anxiety or having suicidal ideations for months or years and not telling anybody. Like, when do people reach out for help? What do you guys see as that sort of maybe some indications, some markers that people need to reach out for more help?
I think I would kind of say if it's interfering with normal life in a significant way, like they're failing to go to to school, they're not going to, you know, regular activities. They're just isolating and really struggling to get out of the house as a regular pattern. I don't know what kind of a timeline to throw on it, but I think parents are going to know, like, this is just not normal. This isn't healthy, and parents have to use that parental instinct and say, this has been going on too long, and I don't want this to become the pattern.
Or like even just like the pediatrician or your family physician, they have like the general anxiety disorder as like little tool. Like I remember I had severe anxiety as a teen, and I had no idea what it was. I just thought something, like I thought I was bad or something. Like I didn't know what it was. No one was explaining that to me. No one was. And I was the type that wouldn't reach out and like say what was happening, right? So I was just dealing with it by, I don't know, going to all my friends' house every day and just running. And so when I hit a point where I was finally introduced to that little assessment tool, I was like such a relief to me, because I was like, oh my goodness, this is a thing. Like I don't like this isn't necessarily normal. Like it was a relief to me to be like, yes, every day. So like those, just like even talking to your like family doctor, it just utilized that tool, because they have those tools as well. So that's also an option if you're just feeling totally lost on a scale of like what's happening and how bad and how often and things like that.
Right. And again, I just go back to teenagers. Every day is the worst day ever, right?
Right.
But again, looking at trends. So like giving it, especially as the parent or the responsible adult in the situation, looking at them of like, okay, yes, they're struggling today, but is today normal for a couple of months? Is this what we're dealing with for a couple of months, or even several weeks? You know, if something changes or shifts and it's like, okay, we're not seeming to get out of this. Then I always appreciate it. Habits are easier to break when they haven't been established for long periods of time. Associations are easier to switch in our brains when those neural pathways have not been tromped over and over and over again. So sooner rather than later, assessments. There's some general anxiety screenings online that you could also do as well. Have your teen fill it out for your teen of like, are they within sort of normal limits? And I would suggest, if you do use those, fill them out every day for a couple of days and see, or even a week, and see like, okay, today they seem today's really high. Tomorrow is not that high, or yesterday wasn't as high as today, things like that. And so then kind of take an average over a couple of times before, really reaching out for help. But
yeah, and if you can't associate the anxiety with something that makes sense, like, well, we just moved, and so they're going to be a little high anxiety for a month or two, or they've got a medical condition, or the normal stressor, that we can allow for that, but still have the conversation and normalize that with the teen. Yeah, you should be a little anxious right now. This is your normal response, and that makes sense.
Yeah. So again, first day of school, first day of high school, first day of middle school, like those are big changes. Those are big, new schools, new big changes that are absolutely normal. They're going to come with some normal anxiety, right? But then if they're not able to get in that pattern, that's a good indicator that they probably need some additional help. Should teens be on meds for things like social anxieties or things like that?
I think sorry, Casey.
No, you go ahead.
Just as a therapist, I'm kind of biased towards therapy. I definitely think medication is a tool in the toolbox. I would prefer to try to start with therapy first and see if you see a difference. I will tend to recommend medication when I feel like we've given therapy a really good try here and it's not able to get a foothold because we can't get the central nervous system to calm. And so that's when I try to recommend towards medication. But if the kid is just really, really, really high anxiety and you just don't feel like the words can get in there and have an effect, then maybe you need to start right off with medication.
I think I maybe have a little bit of biases, just like experience and clients that I have had. Maybe it's just coincidence of my experience, but like particularly with females, and like puberty, the onset of puberty, and really watching that and paying attention because their body is going through so much changes, which are normal, but there is like in this this book called Girls on the Brink, she talks, it's the same information I got earlier with the, just being in that constant kind of fight, fight, or freeze. But she also talks about another reason why it's hard to be a teen in this day and age is because of so many environmental things like stressors and like toxins and in our food and the hormones and things like that are just in, different products that we use and things like that. And so really girls really are, and boys are being also like attacked in that sense with their physiological. And so just like, I don't know, I don't have enough information or enough knowledge and stuff with it, but I do see that I think sometimes we chalk up like, oh, it's that time of the month and like that's what being a girl is, and that message that we get as females. And but I think sometimes if that like PMS is what we call it, if it's lasting like more than a week or 2 weeks at the most, I think it's something to kind of pay attention to and talk to your child's doctor about. I have seen that with a couple of my clients. So that's just like another little aspect of all of this to kind of consider is like puberty and the changes of the body and adjusting to that, being able to talk about that. Are you able to talk about that with your kid? And, because those are kind of a lot of just different things to consider too.
Absolutely. Yep. And medication is definitely going to affect some of those things as well. And so working closely, like this is, I think the best results come when you have a pediatrician or a med manager of some sort working together in conjunction with the family and a therapist, working together to really help manage the kids' anxiety. And oftentimes, they don't need medication therapy, and being able to, again, control or help manage or soothe that central nervous system when it does come online, right? Like throughout their entire life, they are going to be in situations forever that they feel discomfort. And the sooner we can help them learn how to regulate and go back to sort of a regulated state, a state of comfort when they are dysregulated, the better skills they're going to have just for life in general. And so, those are great skills to learn in therapy. And I'm, again, maybe a little biased towards therapy as well, but
most of us don't get that. Like I would think most of us don't get that from like that's a gift if you can give that to your kid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think, again, looking at yourself, how you're reacting to their response, and helping them to learn to breathing yourself, being comfortable with that, grounding, using that in everyday life, and working that into your family's daily life can be really, really helpful with managing stuff like that. But again, those are important things to kind of look at if that's not happening for you or your teen, can't sleep for a couple of days on end. It might need to go to medication so that we can then manage the central nervous system.
Yeah, I think you raised a good point, Chelsea, too, about what are the parents modeling about how they deal with stress.
Yep.
And modeling that sense of acknowledging that I'm stressed, but we'll work through this is important too.
Absolutely. That's great. Any last parting thoughts on social anxiety and how to manage it and how to help your kid? And any last parting thoughts, words of wisdom?
I think just know that it's not an easy like quick thing to overcome. And like I feel for myself, because I have kids that are growing up, and and I'm trained in this stuff, and it's so hard, to even knowing about it isn't enough sometimes. So just giving yourself that grace, and at the end of the day, like, you are in charge of providing safety and providing love, but you're not in control of your kid to some extent. So it's sometimes letting go of that responsibility and that burden to fix everything can actually fix a lot of things. Like, if you just say, like, I'm here to, like, really just, like, let you have somebody that is your cheerleader and loves you and wants you to be happy, and I'm not in charge of all the decisions. Like, I think sometimes that can help, but also balancing that with the boundaries stuff. So yeah.
Anything from you, Laura?
Nope, I think that was a great wrap up. Casey, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you for your wisdom on dealing with social anxiety in teens and supporting parents and how they can reach out for help. And Casey, will you mention that book again one more time? What was the book you mentioned?
It's called Girls on the Brink, and she has one for boys. I think it's called like Boys on the Edge or something. Okay, let me get it right so I don't mess this up, but it is called Girls on the Brink, Helping Our Daughters Thrive in an Era of Increased Anxiety, Depression, and Social Media, by Donna Jackson Nakazawa.
Okay, sounds good. And she has a boy one too, maybe out there as well.
Yeah, and it's an audiobook as well, so that's always kind of nice to be able to listen to it. And it's got a lot of like scientific stuff that maybe isn't for everybody, but the core points are really, really interesting and helpful, I would say.
Awesome. We will also put that in the show notes as well, just so that people, if you're listening to the podcast and want a direct link to that, we can do that as well. But thank you for listening to The Puzzle of Us. And this is Chelsea Peterson, your host, and we'll see you next time.